Hello, hello, adventurers, and welcome back to the Dragon's Lair. Well, today we will be discussing possibly the unluckiest person in the entire series, Ronald Weasley. So, let's jump right into it, shall we? Before we do, I have to say, some things came up and Chill is unfortunately not with me today. It's just me, so I'm sorry. But, let's jump right into it, shall we? Starting off with strength. There isn't a whole lot we have for strength with Ronald Weasley. One evidence of bad strength would be, well, let's go ahead and start this off with spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. We should be good. In the second movie, Chamber of Secrets, Ron and Harry get separated in the tunnel to the Chamber of Secrets. So, there's that. Well, they get separated by rocks falling in between them, and the rocks aren't huge, if you understand. So, they're big rocks. They're moderately sized, but they're not giant boulders that you can't move ever sort of size, right? Reasonably speaking, they should be able to move some of the rocks. However, they couldn't, for whatever reason, in the movie. So, that's a relative example of bad strength. Now, an example of good strength would be during his Quidditch tryouts a little later on in the series, where Ron is trying out to be the goalie, right? And as such, he makes a few good blocks and takes a few solid hits from the ball and other players on the field. So, that would be an example of good strength. All in all, I have to say that there's not really a whole lot of information about it. And as such, I'm putting it... I would probably go for a strength score at 10. However, 8 to 12 also makes sense, just kind of a middling ground, because there's not a lot of info. If there's something you can think of in either direction, feel free to let me know, and feel free to use that as your score. Moving into dexterity. As I said before, well, let's start with this. Spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. We should be good. As I said before, Ron was a pretty good goalie for the Quidditch team, right? There's speculation as to why exactly that was. Not on our part, but some on the part of the characters in the show. I won't actually say why, just in case you haven't seen the movie, or you plan to see the movie and you just haven't seen this one yet. I'll get to it a little later with the items video. So, a little sneak peek. As for other things, right? So that speaks to his agility, his speed on a broom, that sort of thing. His stealth is mediocre, as far as we know. He used the Cloak of Invisibility a few times, and even then it was usually a lot of close calls with him being discovered. We never really got to see him dance, ever. That was a thing that happened during one of the movies, or it was supposed to, and it never really came to fruition, so we never got to see it. We don't know his dexterity when it comes to that sort of thing. As for dodging and weaving spells, there was the time Harry was teaching people the real-world knowledge that he had, and Ron was one of the people he was teaching. They were dueling each other, not Ron and Harry, but the students that Harry was teaching were dueling each other, and there were times Ron was missed by spells, we'll say. Whether he dodged them or, to put it in D&D speak, they rolled their attack rolls low. We don't really know, but we can attribute at least some of them to Ron's being able to dodge things. As for that, as for the score, well, there is one more example before I get to the score. The wizard's chess from the first movie. Ron was sitting on the knight, the horse. He was part of the knight piece. And at one point, the knight he's on gets attacked by one of the enemy pieces because it's wizard's chess and the pieces move and actually attack each other. Well, Ron is on that piece and narrowly avoids getting hit by the attacking piece. So there is that to consider as well. As for the score, I'm going to say it's moderately high. I'm placing it at 14 to 16. So it's not low, right? Because he's agile, he's dexterous when it comes to the dodging on broomsticks, and apparently when it comes to dodging giant chess pieces. So that's something to keep in mind. So 14 to 16 for the score. Moving into Constitution. There are a number of times Ron gets attacked. Just by being in close proximity to Harry Potter, it happens. So there is that to keep in mind. For instance, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. We should be good. When in the Deathly Hallows movies, they're getting attacked towards the end, and spells start flying in all directions through the house they're in. They have to duck and cover and try not to get hit, and they all manage to relatively not do that. So there is that. That sounds a little bit more like a dexterity thing, but when you start looking into how often he has to avoid dying to spells, it kind of makes more sense as to why it's Constitution. When you play it in with the duels that I mentioned a minute ago, how a few of them hit, and he had to deal with the effects, and usually was able to shrug them off pretty quickly. There was the paralysis that happened to him in that movie. I can think of an explicit instance where he was throwing up slugs because of a spell he cast on himself through a broken wand. That sort of thing. He takes a rather big beating and always comes out alive. Sometimes he's a little worse for wear, but the point is he's able to take things in stride, essentially. So there is that to keep in mind. You also have to keep in mind that he was friends with Harry Potter, and Dementors were all around them pretty much constantly from the third movie onwards. Although, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think Ron ever faced a Dementor. There might have been one or two times, like I can think of a time where they were close. Ron was close to a Dementor, but I don't think he ever had one try to eat his soul. Which I guess makes sense considering that he is a ginger. Well, I'll let you do with that what you may. As for the score, I have to say another 14 to 16. Because he takes hits in stride and is pretty good at it. I guess he does have quite a bit of experience with it. Moving into intelligence. There's not a whole lot I can say here. He's not the one that the group goes to for ideas, right? As such, we never really get to see his intelligence. But he does try. He makes an effort. He's not the one they go to first, but he has his moments where he's able to think and usually help someone out along their way of figuring out what they need to do next. Because of that, I'm going to put his intelligence score at right around 12. Just because we never get to see him use his intelligence, but he's got some. He's able to help people along their path. Moving into wisdom. He's got a little bit of wisdom there. He's able to take his knowledge that he has and put it into practice, right? So, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1... we should be good. When playing wizard's chess, right? For those who don't know, the objective of chess is to maneuver your pieces around the board in such a way where you can capture, we'll say, the other player's king. The king is the most important piece, although it is the weakest. And wizard's chess is no different, except the pieces move on their own. That's what makes it Wizard's Chess. So Ron is able to lead himself, Hermione, and Harry through a game of Wizard's Chess where their lives are very much at stake. All the while not getting the king attacked, also while not getting Harry or Hermione attacked. In fact, the only time one of them is attacked is near the very end, and he's fine in the long run. It's Ron himself, and he's fine in the long run. So just the fact that he's able to maneuver his pieces throughout the board without getting the king attacked and without getting his friends attacked kind of goes to show you just how, if not intelligent, able to think through a situation Ron is. So that has to count for something. As for a little bit of different real-world knowledge, we'll say, in one of the last few movies, Ron is able to use what he knows about Parseltongue from Harry's speaking in his sleep. So he takes bits that he's learned from when Harry was sleep-talking, essentially, and is able to use that to open up the Chamber of Secrets. That's taking his real-world knowledge and being able to put it into practice. I'm not entirely certain how Ron knew that you needed to speak Parseltongue to enter the Chamber of Secrets. I would assume Harry told him. But that is an assumption. Maybe I missed that portion of the movie. That is a possibility. But from what I understand, it wasn't spoken on, and it was Harry that told him that he needed to speak Parseltongue to get into the Chamber of Secrets. Moving into charisma, the final statistic. Spoiler alert. 3, 2, 1. We should be good. Just covering my bases in case I say anything that might be considered a spoiler. But I don't think it's a spoiler to say that Ron is one of the most awkward and unlucky characters in the show, right? Just things that happen to him are sometimes through his fault, sometimes through no fault of his own. Not always good. They're usually bad things that happen to him, right? As I said, when he was coughing up slugs, he did that to himself, but it's kind of a bad scenario, and that sort of thing. Well, in the first movie, and we know this already, but in the first movie, the most awkward character manages to befriend one of the most famous wizards in existence, second only to a Tom Riddle. Ron manages to befriend Harry Potter very quickly. Pretty much immediately after meeting him, I would say. So there's that. And a little later on, he manages to befriend Hermione Granger. He even manages to go a little bit beyond just befriending Hermione Granger. So there is that. Now, you know, he's not a performer, right? We see that every time, for the most part, he gets into a duel with another wizard, usually bad things happen and he winds up embarrassing himself. But when it comes right down to it, I've already said spoiler alert, so I'm fine here. But he's able to do what needs to be done in the end. And over time, people start to like him. He kind of gets over himself, gets out of his own way, and manages to make more friends and become more and more popular. Although it's going to be hard to live down coughing up slugs. So there is that. As for the score, I have to say, just from what I know about, well, having watched it, I have to say 18 to 20. It makes sense to me. Yes, there are times where his charisma is not the greatest. For instance, the dance scene in the Goblet of Fire. But when you put everything together, the good instances definitely outweigh the bad, at least in my opinion. As for the racing class, moving into this next portion, for the straightforward build, obviously he's a human. Because all of his statistics were pretty close together and relatively moderate to high, I went with the normal human build. So you get, I believe it's +1 to all ability scores. I'll double check that and put that down in the description below just to make 100% certain, but I'm pretty sure it's +1 to all ability scores. Yeah, it has to be, because +2 would be way too powerful. There would be no point in ever playing any other race if it was +2 to every ability score, so it's got to be +1. As for the class, straightforward. It's pretty obvious he's going to go wizard. Nothing explicitly fit with Ron. Nothing went against him. It was just kind of, it works. It's not like perfect for him, but it works. So my advice, if you're doing a straightforward build, would be to pick whichever spell you need to have most of. So if you're going to be dealing damage, it's probably going to be Evocation. If you're going to be conjuring things, it's going to be Conjuration. Abjuration, if you're going to go more the protection route, that sort of thing. Whatever works best. I personally would go with probably Evocation and Conjuration, just because when I was reading through the different abilities they give you, those are the two that stood out to me as useful when it comes to Ron Weasley. But that's my opinion. This is, of course, for a level 20 build. Into the conceptual racing class, Elf or Half-Elf makes sense. Half-Elf is probably better because you get to choose, your own ability score improvements. So there is that. Fire Ganassi works for the hair, but that's about where those similarities lie. The race that makes the most sense to me is Stout Halfling. Now, let me explain. That's going to be a little weird to hear. Let me explain. Ronald Weasley is not short in the movie, but this is the conceptual build, so I'm not going based off of height. I'm going based off of sometimes Ron is very lucky, right? I think it's hard to argue with that, where you have instances of, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1, where he's stranded under the water and Harry manages to save him, right? That's through no ability of Ron's himself, but it's pretty lucky that he managed to still get saved. Then you have things like the Quidditch tryout. Now, Ron was under the impression that he was under a spell, and, well, turns out he wasn't. He was able to act himself, and, it's pretty lucky the way it all kind of turned out for him. He just seems to have an uncanny ability for things to go in his favor when he needs them to the most. Not always when he wants them to, but when he needs them to. And when it comes right down to it, Ron was in Gryffindor. So, he was pretty brave. So, there is that. Stout Halfling makes sense. Right? Moving into class, you have a few options. I would go with one of the 3, Bard, Warlock, or Sorcerer. I'm going to briefly touch on all 3. Let's start with the one that's probably the least likely. Bard. So, Ron doesn't play any instruments. I chose Bard because he's a relatively charismatic character, even though sometimes the charisma doesn't go in his favor. Specifically, the performing portions don't go in his favor. He is a charismatic character and would be a charismatic caster. Which is why I chose the 3 classes that I chose. Bard is the least likely because, as I said, he doesn't play an instrument, and, well, he's not good at performing. But if you were going to go Bard, you would probably go College of Valor, just so you can help out your allies, your teammates. Moving into the next class, Warlock. This is a little more difficult, because I'm not entirely sure what the pact would be. I would probably go with Pact of the Old One, so he could... I'll go ahead and say spoiler alert here. 3, 2, 1. We should be good. Pact of the Old One, so his patron could be Dumbledore. It's just the only thing I can think of that somewhat makes sense. No, Dumbledore's not evil, but I don't think it's a requirement for Warlock patrons to be evil. I think that's what usually winds up happening, but I think it's more of a, here's this person that's bestowing power upon you. And it's not explicitly healing magic or that sort of thing, so that's the difference between Cleric and Warlock. That and the amount of spells they cast, which is why I chose this for Ron, because, well, Ron doesn't really cast a whole lot of spells. He does when he needs to, but aside from that, he never really casts spells. Moving into the last option, you have Sorcerer, and this is probably the one I would go with the most, or this would probably be my first pick to make it make a little more sense. Sorcerers are relatively easy, relatively straightforward casters. I would go with Wild Magic Sorcerer, because that seems to be, especially early on, what happens with Ron. He casts spells, and we never really know exactly what's going to happen from it in the first few movies. A little later on, he kind of figures himself out and manages to not have random things happen all the time, but for a while, it's pretty much the wild magic table going on when he casts spells. A little bit of a watered down and less dangerous version of it because plot armor, but you get my point, where it makes sense with the wild magic's table Sorcerer for Ron. Now, that is all I have for you fine adventurers today. So, feel free to check out my Discord or come hang out on Twitch. Go down, if you have a comment, please feel free to do so. Just make sure it's respectful. That's all I ask. I hope to see you guys soon for my next video that will be on Hermione Granger. But until then, I will catch you all later.